Thank you, Vino. Thank you so much for inviting me and for inspiring me to do some of this work. In my research, I've become convinced that some really weird stuff is happening. And having spent the past day and a half here, I'm more confident than ever that that's true. Vino had mentioned some of the things that we see happening, robots that are going out into the wild and picking lettuce or working alongside humans in factories. We just heard about machines diagnosing diseases or even depression. Cars are beginning to drive themselves. You can see people in our cities, they're talking to machines, and perfectly rational people expecting the machines to talk back to them and give them answers. A lot of this would have been science fiction 10 years ago. Now, there's certainly a lot of hype about some of the claims, but there's also, we're seeing here, some reality to these changes that are going on. We're also seeing some big changes in the economy. Globally, there are more billionaires than ever before. The United States has record wealth, over $80 trillion of wealth now. GDP per person is at a record level. But we also have median income. The income of the person at the 50th percentile is actually lower now than it was 10 years ago, even lower than it was 20 years ago. And it doesn't seem to be recovering as the economy is beginning to turn around. It's still quite low. The share of people working, the employment to population ratio, has been falling for 15 years. So there's some unusual things going on, and there's also some hype about the economic side. But I want to show you some of the data about what's happening, and also maybe make the case that what we see happening on the technology side is not unrelated. In fact, it is related to these economic changes that are going on. And from what we heard this morning, I think we can be confident that over the next 10 years, we'll see at least as much technological breakthrough, as much technological change. And that means that we'll probably see at least as much economic disruption. Now, I want to talk about some of the fundamentals that are going on in the economy along those lines. And so, if we get the slides up here. What we'll be talking about is the second machine age, and one way to think about what the second machine age is and how it's different is to think about what it takes to change the world. We heard this morning about, hiring great talent and products and business models, but I'm going to go back to kind of an engineering, MIT geekish way and say that to change the world, what you need is two things. You need a power system and a control system. A power system because the world is mostly made of atoms held in place by physical forces, and you need to physically be able to have the power to transform the world. I mean, literally, if you want to literally change the way the world is arranged. But that's not enough. You also need a control system to figure out how to arrange things, how to organize things, what to do with them, so set your goals. Now, for most of history, humans were both the power system and the control system, but a wonderful thing happened about 200 years ago. The Industrial Revolution was set off by a technological breakthrough, James Watt's improved steam engine, and as a result, we started using machines as the power system, vastly amplifying our muscles and replacing animal muscles as well. And later, the internal combustion engine and electricity also further amplified that. More recently, we've started using machines to do thinking, to do the cognitive side, and to be the control system as well as the power system. The Industrial Revolution led to a real turning point in human history in terms of economic growth. Before that, living standards were more or less stagnant for not just centuries, but millennia. Afterwards, it was the kind of hockey stick that Vino sees in his business plans that are sent to him, but it happened for all of humanity. We're about 50 times richer than our ancestors a couple centuries ago were because of these improvements in the power system. It's hard for me to believe that using technology to automate and augment the control system, our mental powers, won't be at least as important in the scope of human history in terms of what's happening. But we're still kind of in the early days of that. There are also some differences. The power system still needed a control system. A locomotive needed an engineer, or factory needed people to organize it. So humans were necessary. In fact, humans became more valuable the better the power system was. In economic terms, they were a complement to technology. And you see that in that wages rose all through this period. The value of one more worker was ever increasing. It's not so obvious, though, in the second machine age, whether humans will be a complement or a substitute mostly. You can think of examples of both those things going on. And if you look at the data, it's a little troubling. Wages, as I just mentioned, are stagnating or falling for the majority of people in developed countries where the technologies are most advanced. So there may be some evidence that it's not working out so much as a complement. But as I'll argue later, that's to some extent a choice. Now, I'll very quickly touch on some of the technologies. There are three big areas that we used to think just 10 years ago were uniquely human. I had a great set of classes where we debated and discussed what humans could do that machines couldn't. Where was the division of labor? And we came up with three broad areas, dexterity and nimbleness, language, and complex problem solving and unstructured problem solving. And one of the examples that we all agreed was something that was really hard, if not impossible to automate, was driving a car through traffic. That just didn't seem like something a machine was destined to do anytime soon. Of course, I was completely wrong. We were all wrong in that discussion. A few years later, 6 years later, Andy and I were grinning like idiots. Andy's the co-author of the book, because we rode down Route 101 in a driverless automobile. And so that was happened a lot faster than we anticipated. And in fact, all three of these categories, there's been a lot of progress. And again, there's some hype, but there's also a lot of progress. Yesterday, Google announced unveiled their purpose-built driverless automobile, no steering wheel. Baxter is working alongside humans in factories now for about the equivalent of $4 an hour. They just came out last month with a new version, Sawyer, that's about twice as dexterous and nimble and working even more cheaply. Atlas is a robot 6 feet tall that's in the new DARPA Robotics Challenge. The last one was to make a driverless car. The new one is to have a robot like Atlas here be able to get into a vehicle and drive it a bit, walk across a rubble field, pick up a hose, attach a nozzle, open a lever, go up some stairs, a series of other steps like that. And if you're kind of an entrepreneur, you could imagine if you had a machine that could do all those steps, imagine the things you could use it for in a warehouse or in a factory and other things. By the way, that DARPA Robotics Challenge is 2 weeks away. It's in June 4th and 5th if you want to go watch Atlas and the other robots compete in that. And I should say, they can't yet do all those tasks really pretty well, but if you talk to Gil Pratt, who runs the DARPA Robotics Challenge, he feels like they're way ahead of where he anticipated them being and making progress faster than they did in the driverless vehicle competition. And then this is finals week at MIT, and the scariest things aren't necessarily in those finals rooms, but there are robots running around out in front there. This one can outrun Travis in the quarter mile, can outrun any of us in the quarter mile dash. So we're also seeing progress on language and voice recognition. Tom Mitchell at Carnegie Mellon says that we're in the midst of a 10-year period where we went from machines mostly not being able to understand us to machines being able to mostly understand us pretty well and us being able to communicate with them, not just with voice recognition. Microsoft unveiled earlier this week the beta version of their Skype Universal Translator. There's ones that even write stories, and the New Yorker has an article coming out in next week's issue about digital journalism replacing more and more journalists. You may know that they write short news stories, earnings reports, thousands of sports things. And of course, machines are being used in a whole set of other categories. There's one that answers questions in a call center. There are ones that do legal and paralegal work, sifting through lots of documents, investment advice. We heard about some of the medical diagnosis affecting all sorts of white-collar jobs that previously weren't affected. So what does this all mean for the economy? Let me spend a little bit more time on that, and then I'm looking forward to having some discussions and questions from all of you. The first and most important thing is that it's just generating an enormous amount of wealth, not all of which, in fact, much of which is not being measured very well. You see that in terms of much lower prices, even to the point of free. This Radio Shack ad from the 1990s is interesting because virtually everything for sale for thousands of dollars in that ad is now available as part of your smartphone. In fact, in most cases, there are free apps in there for whether it's the video recorder or the camera or the music player or the answering machine, if you guys remember what one of those is, computer, etc. And lots of new apps that we never had before in terms of being able to, as we've heard just the session before, diagnose different kinds of medical problems and solve all sorts of issues that we hadn't seen before. GPS wasn't in that ad, but that's something we all take for granted now, for instance. So that's good news. But there's, and that's worth a lot. That isn't necessarily captured in the GDP statistics. Our estimate in a study we did is that there's about $300 billion of new value added to the economy from these free apps that are not counted at all in the GDP statistics, because GDP measures all the goods and services that are bought and sold. So if something has zero price, if it's a free app, it adds zero to GDP, even though it could be quite valuable and generally is quite valuable to consumers. But that's not all. There's also been some changes that are a little more troubling. If you look at 4 key statistics that economists like me like to track, productivity, employment, income, and real GDP, you see that a couple of them, GDP and productivity, have risen relatively steadily, and they are at all-time highs right now. And it used to be that all of these kind of rose together in a tightly coupled fashion, that when overall GDP went up, so did median income and so did employment. But as you can see from this chart, there's been kind of a decoupling. Andy and I call this the great decoupling, where median income basically started stagnating. Oh, you can't see, yeah, you can see it here. Back in the 80s or early 90s, and same thing with the employment to population ratio that is also now lower than it was a while back. So there's an implicit social contract there that doesn't seem to be continuing the way it did earlier in the century. What's going on? How can this be? And this was actually a puzzle, because I was sort of naturally an optimist when I think about what the technology can do and the wealth being created and the health and the other unmeasured benefits. But as I struggle with these data, I saw that these data are accurate. There's not a flaw in the data. You can quibble a little bit about the deflators or whatever, but by and large, that chart is qualitatively what's going on in the economy. And I came to the realization that what's going on is that there's simply no economic law that says that everyone automatically benefits from technological progress. It's possible for technology to make the pie much bigger, to create enormous wealth, but at the same time, some individuals may be not participating or even be maybe made worse off. When the internal combustion engine came along, if you made buggy whips, you weren't necessarily benefiting from that. So it could be a little small group that's hurt. But in theory, it could be 50% of the population or 80 or 90% of the population that isn't participating in that. Now, just to be clear, for the past 200 years, it hasn't been that way. It has been a rising tide that lifted all boats. But for the past 10 or 20 years, there has been this decoupling where there's not everyone participating the way that they used to. And in particular, it is due to what economists call biased technical change. So let me describe to you 3 kinds of biased technical change. That is technology that affects different groups differentially. The first kind of biased technical change is what economists call skill-biased technical change, and that is that high-skilled and mid-skilled workers may be affected differently than low-skilled workers. And in particular, if you look at, say, education, that's one of the many ways you can slice these data. They tell a fairly similar pattern. In the first part of the century, actually, as far as we can tell, for a couple hundred years, there was all skill groups were benefiting. Whether you had a college degree or only a high school degree, incomes were going up until about the early 1970s. Then there was an oil shock and recession. Everybody took a hit for a little while. And since then, there's been this great spreading out, this fanning out, where more educated workers on average have done much better. Less educated workers, I know we have some dropouts in the room here who have done pretty well, but if you look at the average, that hasn't worked out for a lot of people quite as well. So there's been a bigger gap now than there ever has been before in terms of the returns to education. You can look at it in other dimensions as well, and you get similar kinds of patterns. So that's, and why is this happening? There's a variety of reasons, but the consensus among economists is that the single largest reason is because of technical change that has automated a lot of mid-skill and low-skill jobs that high school and some college graduates have, and has made more valuable those jobs that require more education relatively. Although, to be a little more nuanced about it, it's actually the middle of the employment distribution that's been hit the hardest. The routine information processing jobs like clerks, basic accounting, bookkeeping, middle management, those have been the most automated. So whether you look at it by wages or by employment, you see kind of a U-shaped pattern. Those at the high end of the wage distribution have actually done pretty well. And maybe surprisingly, The people down at the other end have had decent employment, not so great on wages. Those are jobs, whether it's a housekeeper or janitor or gardener, some kinds of farm workers, some other kinds of routine, simple manual kinds of tasks have held up reasonably well. Some kind of areas of retail. It's the middle that's been hit the hardest. And in the book, we describe a lot more what's going on there, but that's a pattern having to do with how the technology affects different areas. About 60% of Americans and other advanced countries of the workforce is involved in mid-skill routine information processing work in that middle category there. Another category that we've seen, another kind of biased technical change, is what's going on between capital and labor. Thomas Piketty wrote a book about capital in the 21st century where he really emphasized this point. And as you can see, the share going to labor in red and then capital, they kind of danced around for much of the past century, but since around the year 2000 or so, they've really diverged sharply. Through the recession, through the boom, as things are coming back, the labor share is now at an all-time low. This is true not just in the United States, but there was a recent study that looked at about 50 different countries around the world and said that it was a pervasive pattern happening in all these different countries. The exact numbers differ, but the trend is common in all of them, where labor is getting a smaller share. And in some ways, this even underestimates how severe the effect is, because counted in labor are CEO salaries, sports salaries, and other kinds of salaries. So if you look at the typical worker, they're doing even worse than this chart might suggest. Meanwhile, profits are at a record high, both in absolute terms and in terms of a percentage of GDP. And the third kind of technical change, and this one isn't as well understood, but we talk about it some in the book, and we're really studying it quite a bit, is, for lack of a better word, call it superstar bias technical change. The ability of people who have some kind of special talent or insight or maybe luck to be able to replicate and scale that much more easily to a global audience than they could previously. It has to do with some of the properties of digital goods. Whether you're literally a rock star or whether you're a great technical person, you can now reach a much broader audience through the internet and other media than you could previously, and that means you can become a billionaire in a way that couldn't have previously. Some of my students have written apps that reach millions of people, in just a matter of a few months, and that's something that wouldn't have happened a decade or two ago. Michael Spence and Andy and I wrote about this in some depth in an article last summer. We talked about how it's the scarce resource and less is labor, but it's also not capital so much going to the future, but rather ideas and the ability to execute on those ideas and scale them up in a way that you couldn't previously. And part of the reason is because of the special properties of information goods. If you make something, digitize something, and you take that process and you once it's digitized, you can replicate it. You can make a copy of it. You can make 10 copies. You can make 100 million copies. And each of those copies can be made for almost zero cost. And each of those copies is a perfect replica of the original. And each of those copies can be transmitted almost anywhere on the planet for almost instantaneously. So think about that. Free, perfect, instant. Those are three adjectives that didn't apply to most goods and services through most of history, but now they come standard when anything is digitized. And they lead to some really weird and unusual economics. They often lead to winner-take-all or winner-take-most economics, these power law distributions where you can scale up tremendously. And that shows up in part in the business literature. It also shows up in individual incomes. Some people talk about the 1%. We looked at that. The 1% has their own 1%. This is the 100th of 1% here. And what you see is that the share of income going to the 100th of 1% is also at a record high now, and it seems to be going up. It was also pretty high right before the Great Depression, if that's any comfort. But that's where we seem to be going most recently. So let me just sum up with a challenge to all of you and to us as a society, and then I'm looking forward to having some questions and discussion. Digital technologies, I think it's safe to say, will continue to accelerate. More and more things can be digitized. More in the world will be datafied. So those kinds of economics I just described, the free, perfect, and instant, that can create tremendous wealth but also change the distribution, are likely to become more pervasive as well. However, our skills and our organizations and our institutions are lagging. As the technology races ahead, there's a bigger and bigger gap between the kinds of skills that we have to match those, the organizations that are designed to work with them, whether in companies or at the governmental level, our policies. They don't change nearly as fast. They change at a human pace of change as opposed to Moore's law, our digital rate of change. And that means there's a mismatch, and a growing mismatch, not just at skills, but more broadly. And so if we just do the same thing, we're not going to have a very good match. We need to rethink things. And that doesn't mean stopping or slowing down technologies. It means working harder to speed up the way businesses are organized and how our institutions are organized. So I'd like to propose, just as we had a grand challenge to invent some new technologies, a grand challenge to invent some new economic institutions and some new business models, ones that can not just create wealth, but also create shared prosperity. And I think that can be done, that we can think of ways of creating technologies that are complements to humans and to make humans more valuable, as well as technologies that create wealth in a more narrowly focused way. So let me just leave it at that and say if you want to learn more about it, we're working very hard on this at our initiative on the digital economy and invite you all to participate in that in different ways. And if you want to read more about it, here's some links that you can get some more information about it. But let me stop there and open it up to questions from all of you. Thanks very much.
Why don't we start with a question in front here?
Thank you. Erik, my original home country is Turkey.
Yeah.
Since I went to middle school, I have seen some technological changes that took 10 years, 20 years to be developed in the US, come overnight to Turkey, which was great.
Yes.
But regarding the initiatives you are mentioning here, I have noticed that you are not dividing US versus non-US, developed versus developing versus underdeveloped. What do you envision this sudden change to impact developing and underdeveloping?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very important because obviously most people still don't live in developed countries. So I've spent time visiting a lot of developing countries. And I would say we're seeing some of the effects first in the United States, and partly because the data is better here and partly because the technology is more advanced. A lot of my research is focused on that. I just also know more companies here. But when I go visit other countries, I can't help but think that in some ways, some of them are even more in the bullseye of this change than the United States. For instance, you go to China. Many of you have probably been to China. You see those factories where people are working. There's often hundreds or thousands of people working side by side doing very routine, rote kinds of work. And their business strategy has basically been to have, hey, lower cost labor. It's not necessarily more skilled or more sophisticated work, but it's lower cost, and they can outcompete Western Europeans or American or Japanese workers for that work. But competing on the basis of low wages, while it may work against other humans, is not the best way to compete against robots. And more of those factories are becoming rapidly automated. People like Terry Gao are buying, they say, hundreds of thousands, even he says millions of robots to replace millions of human workers. And some of those tasks, you can see how it's, I'm not a genius programmer, but I could see writing a machine to do some of those, creating one to create some of those simple tasks pretty easily. So those countries are going to, I think, as you suggested, have an even quicker shock because they're not going to have that longer transition, not that it's been that long, that the United States and other countries have gone through from the first machine age to the second machine age. Instead, a lot of that work, I think, very rapidly, the routine, repetitive work, robots like Baxter will be able to do that much more quickly. And that puts them, I think, in a tough position. They're going to have to make some of the same changes that developed countries are in the process of making, but for a much bigger workforce. It's going to be tough. Go ahead.
Danny, and then let's go back there first, and then.
Okay.
Thank you for that. So what do you think is going to happen if we look forward, right? I'm thinking about agriculture, which is an area where I work. 200 years ago, about 90% of the population was involved in producing food, and now it's 1 to 2%.
Right.
All those people ended up doing something different, which is probably better for the overall economy of the world. Do you think that the same is going to happen this time, or can we expect something different?
Well, the most honest answer I can give you is I don't know. I don't know for sure because there's people who say, "Hey, look, it's always worked out in the past. Just chill, Eric. You know, we're gonna find a way to work through it." And you know that it's true. It has worked out in the past. Agriculture is a great example, going from 90% to about 42% in 1900, now less than 2%. And the part of the reason that happened was because as old jobs got automated, technology created new jobs, and particularly entrepreneurs, whether it's Henry Ford or we'll hear from Bill Gates tonight and others, helped invent entirely new industries that employed literally millions of people, often in much more productive things than what they were doing before. So technology can both destroy and create jobs. But I'm not sort of an automatic optimist about that. I think that it's possible that, and certainly in the past 10 years has shown, that the automation side can happen a lot faster than the creation side. And again, there's no economic law that will keep on happening. And you know, don't blame me for this analogy because it was first done by Vasily Leontiev, an economist, but he looked at what happened to horses and said that there's some lessons there about what can happen to the value of human labor. As some technologies came along, the saddle and other kinds of chariots, horses became more and more valuable, and more horses got jobs, right up to around 1900. And then very suddenly, the demand for horses fell quite precipitously. The technologies that made them more valuable, new technologies made them less valuable, and people did not think of new ways of using horses. Today, if somebody gave me a horse, said, "Hey, Eric, you could use this, you can go between classes or whatever," I would say, no. And they say, "Well, it's free." And I say, "No, it's too expensive." So I think that humans, of course, are vastly more complicated. I have an article coming out next month about how humans are different than horses, just to kind of push that analogy a little bit more. But it's actually not so obvious that people keep thinking of new things that humans can do better than machines. I'm hopeful that at least for the next 10, 20, 30 years, the people in this audience, the entrepreneurs here, will think of amazing new things that people can do with the help of machines. But as you go further and further into the future, it gets harder and harder to think of the uniquely human tasks.
Eric, is that an emotional response from you, or because the logical conclusion is, if you replace what humans did after steam power took over, which is brain power, and you replace brain power, then the logical conclusion is the opposite, and we should know that those jobs won't exist.
So let me
Are you being emotional?
I don't think so, no. I think I'm trying to be rational, but you can correct me. Let me say that one of the things that humans do have as a distinction between machines is emotional, though. And one of the areas that we may actually see the biggest job growth, although I've heard some counterexamples from the people I met with over the past day here, is in interpersonal skills and emotional connection. So it's not just that you need to be smarter and smarter than machines. That's getting harder and harder to do, and a lot of the companies who've invested have done that. But there's jobs that involve nurturing and motivation and caring and negotiation. A football coach at halftime talking to his team, it just wouldn't be the same if it was a robot football coach. I just don't think so. Or caring for a kid or even an elderly person. So there may be, for at least a little while, some growth in jobs that involve interpersonal skills. They don't have to be people with super high IQs or anything. They're people who have high EQs. And so that may be for a little while. We have some jobs. There's other categories. And maybe I'm not creative enough to think of what the other new things are. So it's a genuine, I don't know for sure in the short run. In the longer run, I think I'm probably with you that eventually, if you turn the dial far enough, it'll be hard to think of something.
My standard joke when people object to my statement that most doctor functions will be replaced is they say, well, there's the human element of care, and I always answer, yes, but wouldn't you want the most humane humans for that? Mm-hmm. And then maybe you shouldn't go to Stanford Med School with high IQ students, go to UCLA Film School for actors.
Yeah. Same thing for professors, I think. I think probably we'll see a lot of MIT professors replaced by people who are far more charismatic.
Why don't we go to Danny for the okay, so his question's answered. It's break time. We'll take one more question.
I thought there was a hand over there, no? Okay.
Yes, in the back there.
Oh, over here.
So Eric, people have talked about states being laboratories for democracy.
Yes.
Countries, can be laboratories for how we grapple with the second machine age.
Yes.
If you had to choose a country where your great grandson or granddaughter were going to be born in, under the what society, which country out there do you think is doing it right in terms of grappling with this new reality?
So I don't think any of them are doing it all of the pieces right, but there's a couple that I this maybe is emotional. I'm not sure. One of them is Denmark, where I happen to be born. Okay, full disclosure. but it's got something called flexible security, where they don't lock people into jobs. But if somebody wants to start a company and it fails, then there's a very generous safety net. And there's some evidence that, contrary to some of the earlier economic theory, that certain kinds of generous safety nets, healthcare, other things, make people more willing to take chances and more willing to be entrepreneurial, especially if they can be flexible, lay off people. So they've been able to do a little bit of both. And the other country, I have to say, is the United States, because the United States, in many ways, has a very entrepreneurial culture. And ultimately, I think that the way we're going to get out of this is not by locking in what we have today and kind of making it soft and safe, but by inventing some of the new ways, just as I mentioned, Henry Ford, Bill Gates, and other people did. And you need an entrepreneurial culture, whether it's the next generation Uber or whatever, that creates millions of jobs for lots of people, finds new ways for people to work. And the U.S., I think, is done very well in that entrepreneurship. But what I want to do, I'll come back to the challenge again, is that there's no inevitability to the technology creating more inequality, or for that matter, technology solving all the problems. It depends on how we use the technology, and that depends on the kinds of business models and the kind of ways that you guys invent that. And I want to put it out there that if you can invent new technologies, you can also invent new business models and economic institutions that maybe will help us navigate through this really interesting time we're going through. Thanks.
Thank you, Erik. I'm going to finish this session by my favorite example. Professor David Cope at UC Santa Cruz has written a program called Emily Howell. You can Google it. That can compose classical music, which really upset some Yale classical music professors, so they had a bake-off, trying to judge human-composed classical music in a blind test against music composed by this program. And the result was the computer pieces were judged as more complex, more nuanced, and obviously the ones written by humans.